Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into World War II to find its real unsung hero. We're asking a pretty fundamental question. What truly wins wars? And I gotta tell you, the answer might not be what you think.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. When you picture victory in a war, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most of us, right, it's heroic soldiers storming a beach, or maybe some brilliant general hunched over a map making a genius move. And sure, those are the images we all know from the movies. But is that the whole story? Not even close.
You see, you've got two sides to this. On one side, you've got the glory. The brilliant generals, the heroic soldiers, the tactics that change everything. But then, there's the guts. We're talking fuel, ammunition, spare parts, even food. And here's the thing. Every single one of those glorious moments on the battlefield is 100% dependent on the gritty, totally unglamorous, but absolutely vital work of supply.
And that brings us to the main character of our story today. Beneath all that heroism, there's this invisible force that actually decides the fate of nations: logistics. Our source material calls it the indispensable artery of war. And, well, that's exactly what it is. And that's the story we're telling. So, to really get a handle on the power of logistics, you have to understand its core principles. Let's call them the superpowers of supply, because honestly, they shape everything that happens on the battlefield.
First up is a big one: sustainment. Now, this isn't about a one-time delivery. It's the ability to provide a continuous, non-stop flow of everything an army needs to function. We're talking bullets, food, medicine, you name it. It's the constant lifeblood that literally keeps a fighting force in the fight, day in and day out.
And this just nails it, right? I mean, what good is the most advanced tank in the world if it runs out of gas? It's just a big, expensive metal box at that point, a bunker. And a soldier without food or ammo, they can't do a thing. Without sustainment, the best weapons and the bravest soldiers are basically useless.
Okay, superpower number 2 is reach. This is all about being able to project your military power over huge distances. Look, it's one thing to fight a war on your own doorstep. It's another thing entirely to keep an army supplied and operating thousands of miles from home. That requires incredibly complex networks, and it's the key to taking the fight to the enemy wherever they are.
And it really is that simple. An army's advance will grind to a dead halt the very second its supplies can't keep up. So, a military's strategic reach is only as long as its logistical supply line. It's a simple and often a really brutal equation. All right, so we've got the theory down: sustainment and reach. Now let's see how these superpowers played out in the real world, starting with two very different but equally critical theaters in Europe.
First, let's look at the Battle of Britain. Germany was facing massive logistical headaches. Their planes had limited range coming from France, and replacing lost aircraft and pilots was putting a huge strain on them. Britain, on the other hand, they were fighting from home. They had these amazing shadow factories for quick repairs and super efficient ground crews. That battle wasn't just won by pilots in the air. It was won by the incredible logistical strength of the RAF on the ground.
And then, the war shifts to a completely different kind of battlefield: the massive deserts of North Africa. This place was defined by what our source brilliantly calls the tyranny of distance. The challenge here wasn't just about having factories. It was about the brutal physical slog of keeping armies supplied across a vast, unforgiving wasteland.
And wow, this slide really shows the difference. The Axis forces, they were relying on these really vulnerable sea lanes from Italy and were constantly short on fuel. But the Allies, they had control of the seas, and with America's industry kicking into high gear, they had an overwhelming supply of everything. This is how the famous Desert Fox, Rommel, for all his tactical genius, was ultimately just strangled by logistics. His tanks literally ran out of gas.
But listen, if North Africa was a logistical nightmare, the Eastern Front was a full-blown catastrophe. This is where you see flawed strategy just collide head-on with the brutal reality of logistics on an absolutely epic scale.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows just how fast things fell apart. In June '41, the German blitzkrieg looks unstoppable. But just a few months later, their supply lines are stretched to the absolute breaking point. Then, the Russian winter hits, something they were totally unprepared for. And the result? A total logistical collapse that leads directly to that devastating turning point defeat at Stalingrad.
So what went wrong? Well, pretty much everything. The Germans completely underestimated the sheer size of Russia. They had no proper winter gear for their soldiers or their trucks. Their supply lines were under constant attack by partisans.
and they simply could not replace the staggering losses of men and equipment. The German war machine wasn't just outfought, it froze and it starved at the end of a completely shattered supply chain. Now, on the flip side, the Soviets showed incredible resilience. They did something astounding. They picked up entire factories and moved them east out of Germany's reach. Plus, they got critical aid from the US through the Lend-Lease program, especially trucks, which were a game changer for moving supplies. They adapted, they survived, and in the end, they overwhelmed the invaders. So for our final stop, let's head to the Pacific, where the battlefield wasn't land, but thousands and thousands of miles of ocean. This was logistics on a scale the world had never seen before. In the Pacific, literally everything came down to this. Could you project and sustain your power across thousands of miles of hostile water? This wasn't a war of front lines. It was a war of shipping lanes, island airfields, and just raw industrial might.
And speaking of industrial might, get this number. The United States built over 140 aircraft carriers during the war. Just let that sink in. That's not just a statistic. That's a logistical superpower in action. The ability to produce and replace on that scale was a weapon all by itself.
And this chart really just boils it all down. Look at the enormous gap in industrial capacity. Japan fought with incredible ferocity, but at the end of the day, they just could not compete with an industrial giant that could outproduce them at every single turn. For every ship or plane Japan lost, America could build 5, maybe 10 more. It was, for them, an unwinnable logistical war.
Okay, so we've looked at the skies over Britain, the deserts of Africa, the frozen plains of Russia, and the vast Pacific Ocean. After all that, what's the final verdict? What's the big takeaway here?
I think this quote from our source material just says it all. Logistics is the vital artery that feeds the sinews of war, without which the most brilliant strategic plans would remain sterile. In other words, a genius plan is just a daydream if you don't have the stuff, the logistics, to actually make it happen.
And this wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a one-off. In every single major theater of World War II, the pattern was the same. Victory belonged to the side with the stronger logistical heart, the side that could consistently pump that lifeblood of war to wherever it was needed most.
And all this history leaves us with a really fascinating question for today. In our age of cyber warfare, AI, and drones, does this so-called boring, gritty work of logistics still hold the ultimate key to victory? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining this explainer.